Hello there, friends, and welcome to another episode of Syracuse Sports. My name is Brent Axe. Great to have you here. However you got here today, we greatly appreciate that. But make sure you subscribe. Spotify, Apple, Syracuse Orange Sports on YouTube. Then you don't have to worry about it. Whenever there's a new episode of Syracuse Sports, it will be sent right to you, and you can listen or watch on demand. Today, Emily Leiker and I continue our series looking back at recent Syracuse football recruiting and transfer classes. We have 2020 and 2021 in the books. 2022 is next, and 2023 will come a little bit later on this week, or depending whenever you're watching or listening, it'll be on those Spotify, Apple, and YouTube feeds as well. So we are excited to dig into that and look back on this class. And as you'll start to see here and in 2023, the transfer portal starts to really take hold in college football, and how important that was for Dino Babers in his last two seasons. Certainly has been for Fran Brown as well, and the recruiting prowess that he has brought in. What is it, 24 commits as we speak for the class of 2025. So we'll weigh that, go back and look at the impact players, who was too high, who was too low, and everything in between. So I mentioned we've got those other two classes already rated. I also have a conversation with Noah Eagle out. Noah, of course, the son of Ian Eagle, Sports Emmy Award winner. He is going to be calling the men's and women's basketball in the Olympics for NBC coming up next month in Paris, amongst the myriad of things that Noah Eagle, at just 26 years old, has already done. You know, a couple of Super Bowls, the French Open. He's been the NBA voice of both the Brooklyn Nets and the LA Clippers. And if I listed the rest of his resume, we'd be here till next Tuesday. So check it out. It was a great conversation with Noah. We talked about a number of things, including, of course, his role as the new voice of the dream teams, if you will, both men's and women's Olympic basketball. That is out as well. Check out our previous episodes. And we thank our Syracuse Sports Insiders for their insight, their opinions, their ideas for this podcast. We've got a lot of fun things planned, got some live pods that we're planning. We've got some drafts coming up that we're planning, and so much of that has come thanks to the feedback of our Syracuse Sports Insiders, whose feedback is always welcome on this podcast as well. Any breaking news I have, you get it first. Any opinions that I have, you get it first. We had a lively discussion about what Derek Coleman had to say about the number 44 with our Syracuse Sports Insiders. Become one today. And becoming a Syracuse Sports Insider means you can text me directly, and the number is 315-847-3895. If you haven't signed up yet, just text the word orange to that number. Try it free for 2 weeks, and then it's just $3.99 a month, less than $1 a week for all that access, opinions, ideas, and everything you get, the back and forth communication with me as a Syracuse Sports Insider. So if you haven't already, text the word orange to 315-847-3895. Get in the pool, man. Come on by. Pool's open for you to jump in, become a Syracuse Sports Insider. Let's get to it, shall we? Emily Leiker and I shine the spotlight on 2022. So, Emily, we have arrived in 2022 in our exercise, looking back on 2020, 2021, 2022 here, and we'll do 2023 as well. And we're now kind of in the heavy slash department here, where you have recruits and transfers really button heads here in terms of who was brought into Syracuse in either category and what their contributions were and what their contributions will be going forward here. And starting at the top of the list here, and again, folks, we're using the 247 composite rankings from 2022 if you want to kind of play along here and look at the list. Francois Nolton Jr., he was a three-star prospect, a defensive lineman from Miami, came in as the highest rated recruit in this class. He played a couple of games for Syracuse, left in 2023. He was a top 100 defensive lineman. He was a four-star according to ESPN. Emily had names like Penn State, Alabama, Florida, Oklahoma, USC on his trail, but was here briefly. And it's notable that the top-rated recruit in this class spent very little time here and eventually moved on.
Yeah, and I don't believe he's landed anywhere yet. I'm double checking right now, but yeah, I don't see anything. He became unrated as a transfer via 247. So yeah, he was one of those guys that was interesting and I think had a lot of potential. This class was freshman that first season that I covered the team, 2022. And it just never panned out for him, or at least didn't pan out in the time frame that he wanted, right? Because he might have been playing this season or might have been in contention or something like that, but decided as a sophomore that he was going to hit the transfer portal.
And you go to the next guy on the list who's highly rated, 3 stars at the top of the recruiting list, still on the roster and still has big things to come. And that's LeQuint Allen, who came into Syracuse from Millville, New Jersey as a 3-star running back. And I mean, the numbers speak for themselves here. Of course, he's over 1,000 yards rushing, 330 yards passing, started 14 games, played in 26 games at Syracuse. He is the #1 running back. He's in the top 35, I believe, rushing all time for Syracuse. And if he has a season by the numbers that he's had, Emily, he's going to move pretty far up that list this year for Syracuse.
Right. And even outside of the numbers, I think that like in these 4 classes we're looking at, LeQuint's probably like firmly in like the top 5 most valuable additions this team has made in the past 4 years. Because not only is he great on the field, we saw him as a really solid backup for his freshman season to Sean Tucker. And then obviously he had his breakout in the Pinstripe Bowl. And then this past season just absolutely dominated. But he is someone that the whole team rallies around, who constantly rallies the team. There were so many moments, especially in the back half of last season, which I know no Orange fan wants to talk about anymore. Like, there were so many times that we would come in and someone would say, like, LeQuint was the one that talked to us after practice. LeQuint was the one who rallied us to go. And so, like, he is, in my mind, like, kind of akin, he's the younger version of like a Marlowe or a Justin, where I think in like 2 years, like if he is still here, he becomes draft eligible this next year. So it's a little, is he going to stay for an extra year? Could he go? But he's one of those guys that, like, the longer you can keep him on this team, the better your team culture is going to be. Like, the more, just like, there's so much that he does for this team outside of on the field. And of course, I mean, you have to bring it up, he almost was not here to do all this last year. And so the fact that he still is, I think, is just so big for SU. And I stand by that. He's a top 5 addition, in definitely the high school, I think, overall,
there's no question about it. And there's 2 things that come to mind. One is what you said. There was the incident with the party and how he went through that process. You and Hayes from syracuse.com documented that well. But the way you described him as a leader and somebody that's out there, he learned from that incident. Wrong place, wrong time. He went through the process. The process itself was put under question, and that would have been a huge loss for Syracuse had he not been on that team. The second thing that comes to mind for me, Emily, is, look, we've gone through these classes, and by the time this exercise is done, we will have gone through the last 4 for Dino Babers. They've had ups and downs. They were good at finding running backs. They recruited Sean Tucker and this guy.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. That's a pretty good track record just to have those 2 in 7 years. I know what the running back position is these days. We talked about that, but those are 2 big scores for Syracuse. And as you noted, we'll see how LeQuint adds to that list this year. We go from LeQuint to Dom Foster, who was suspended ahead of that 2022 season opener, eventually transferred to Independence Community College, and we never saw Foster. They moved him from defensive back to wide receiver, but just not a name that panned out here. Makai Mason played 8 games at, I'm sorry, I'm looking at a different list here. We'll get to Makai Mason here shortly. After Dom Foster, you have Caden Bailey at linebacker here, Emily. 3-star prospect. Interesting in that he spent most of his time as special teams, as a backup linebacker. He's played in 24 games. He got hurt last year at Georgia Tech. And we haven't really done our assignments here. I think LeQuint Allen speaks for himself.
Oh, yeah.
Pretty undervalued.
Undervalued as a 3-star.
Undervalued as a 3-star. Where would you rate Bailey here? He's a top 4 prospect, been productive, hasn't quite broke through as, say, a starting player, but is he meeting expectations at this point, would you say?
I would say so. And again, not to sound redundant for those who have been listening to every episode, but for anyone who hasn't, like my metric for like a 3-star is like someone who contributes, just not consistently, isn't like a starter their freshman year, but can work up to that. And I think Caden Bailey kind of fits that. Like he started out on special teams, which is what a lot of guys do as youngins, and they get a lot of experience playing special teams. And also like to be playing special teams, like in this current college football environment, like so many teams now put their starters on special teams. And so to be a freshman and still have that role, I think tells you something about him. And he has seen a little bit of play at linebacker in some of those games where you put in the third string near the end and stuff like that. So I do think we'll see a little bit more from him at that position this season. Curious to hopefully hear from him about how his injury recovery has gone. I believe it was a lower body injury. I don't think we ever knew specifically what last year. But yeah, I would say he's meeting expectations, right? Like he's a rising junior. He's not even a red shirt. He's a rising true junior, and he's on the field and he's contributing just on special teams and hopefully making that transition to defense.
And you got a 4-2-5 defense now. You've got 2 entrenched linebackers there, and Derek McDonald and Marlo Wax. You got Justin Barron at the star position kind of mixing in there. So just being a linebacker in this defense is interesting because the cream's going to rise to the top, so to say, but he's on the right path to make bigger contributions. Greg Delan comes in as a 3-star prospect from Fort Myers, and he has made 1 start for Syracuse. He's got out there on special teams. Maybe in what we said about Bailey, he kind of fits the description of a 3-star, get on the field, build your way up. Special teams is that ticket on the field for a lot of these younger guys that can't quite crack the lineup but can make a contribution, and seems to be on his way.
Yeah, I'd agree. He's met expectations. I believe I don't know if he ever formally featured on the depth chart. I want to say he did last season as a backup, but he certainly got some playing time in outside at cornerback after Jeremiah Wilson, who we'll talk about later, stepped back from the team, and he played across from Isaiah Johnson. So yeah, he's in that same category. Like he is contributing. I think his role could increase this year. Yeah.
I feel like we've arrived on a name here that will be interesting in terms of what label we put on him. And that's Dennis Jaquez Jr., one of the New Jersey prospects. He came in from Richland specifically as a 3-star. Now, the thing with Dennis is he's got to avoid injury. He played 6 games in 2022. He played 6 games in 2023. When he's healthy, he is right up there. He's on the depth chart. He's a contributor. He's an up-and-coming player for this team. But what would you label him based on what he came in as? I tend to go towards undervalued because when he's out there and he's productive, and I feel like the coaches really like him and he had a great spring, but it's just, you got to wonder about the injury bug, especially a guy who's unfortunately gone through it twice already.
Right. I think he's probably in between right now with a very strong chance to cement himself in that undervalued category this season. He does seem poised to be a starter on that line that's going to feature Fadil Diggs and a couple other big names. He is someone who's been here and is going to be on that line, which feels like there's a time where it was maybe like, oh, is anyone who's been on the defensive line here going to be a starter next year? But he's earned that role. And so, yeah, I think he's in between. You make a good point about like he did get a lot of playing time when he was healthy. It's just that it's kind of been at the same point in both seasons, like that 4 to 6 game range, and the same arm too. So I don't know obviously we've heard so much about like how their strength and conditioning improved and stuff like that. So like, we'll see if maybe that's helped with that. And just like the overall prevention of injury. But I think by the end of the season, there's a strong chance we'll feel that he has been undervalued as a 3-star.
Chad Schuster up next. He was an offensive tackle prospect who came out of Franklin, Wisconsin, and he ended up transferring to Western Michigan, which brings us to another interesting case here, Emily, and that's Jeremiah Wilson, who played 22 games at Syracuse. He made 5 starts. He ended up transferring to Houston this past offseason. Let's see here. He played every game in 2022. He was a starter eventually in the 2023 season. So given that now we're getting towards the middle of the pack on the list, came in, made an impact, played enough that I think we can give him a label here before eventually, as per the way it is in college football these days, saw another opportunity and took it to go to Houston here. I don't know. Like, I want to say overvalued in a way because we just didn't see enough of him and he kind of left while he was building a resume. But considering he's kind of middle of the pack and made an impact in his time at Syracuse, and there's somebody you could say, I think, made the most of his time here, I'm almost tempted to say undervalued, or probably where the dust settles is he met expectations, right? Middle of the pack, 3-star guy. If anything, I'm tilting more towards overvalued. I'm kind of like talking myself into this as we go through here, but he almost fits all three descriptions in a way.
Yeah, he is a very interesting case. I'll remind people that the 2022 off season, I believe it was in January during that first portal window, he did like enter the portal and then
that's a good point.
Withdrew his name and came back for the 2023 season. We tried to talk to him about that once and he didn't really want to get into why, which is understandable. A lot of guys don't, especially when it's that type of situation. But then he stays and he's a starter at cornerback for the first 5 games of the season last year. Now, cornerback was an interesting position for Syracuse last year. There wasn't a lot of depth. Even like Isaiah Johnson starting like at the beginning of the year, I think there was a little bit of doubt about that. We just hadn't seen too much from him either. Obviously he shined. He's another guy we're going to talk about in this class here. But yeah, you know, I think you could make an argument for overvalued because he was a starter or not for overvalued, for undervalued because he was a starter as a sophomore. But knowing that probably had more to do with the lack of depth at that position and the fact that then he got switched off of cornerback and was moved to safety and then didn't really play the rest of the season. We never got like a firm explanation about why that was beyond Dino just decided to switch his position. I think he's probably at met expectations.
Yeah, I think that's the fair one, especially would he be as productive a member on this roster, especially with Fran Brown coming in with the secondary background. He went in the portal once, came out, saw another opportunity to go to the portal. So an interesting case here is, again, as you guys are going to find out here in the next 2 pods in this series, how much the transfer portal really starts to take effect here. But Makai Mason is the next name on our list, the linebacker prospect that came in from Opelika, Florida. I believe I'm saying that correctly. I apologize to the residents of that fine town if I'm not. I played 8 games for Syracuse, 1 in that season, 2022, 7 in 2023. Had schools like Florida State, Georgia Tech, Ole Miss, and Pitt on his trail, but eventually did hit the transfer portal. Belazar Bissett, defensive lineman from Fort Lauderdale, American Heritage, where Oronde Gatson second played, of course. 6'2", 270, 3-star defensive lineman prospect. He played 4 games in 2022, got hurt in spring ball in 2023, and eventually did transfer out as well. Which brings us to Cornell Perry, a safety prospect from Flat Rock, Michigan. He's played 10 games for Syracuse, mostly as a special teams reserve, Emily. So quickly on him, in a position, by the way, that is building more and more depth at Syracuse, both in recruiting in the future and what Fran Brown has brought in through the portal. Has Perry met expectations so far? And we'll see if he gets the opportunity to get into either one of the other categories. That's probably where I would put him.
Yeah, I always, for some reason, and again, this was the first class I came in with, so I don't know why I feel this way, but I always feel like he's older than he is, like he belongs in an older class.
Yeah.
But like remembering that this is only going to be his 3rd season, and note from his bio, he did miss the entire 22 season because of an injury, a spring practice injury, which that spring practice would have been before I got here, so I don't know what that was, but he missed that whole season. He did make a few appearances, I think, at DB last year. He pops in at safety. So yeah, I'd say he's met expectations. I don't know how much playing time he's going to get this year. I think it will continue to be pretty light. But so far for what he has played in, like, I don't think there's anything you can necessarily fault him for it to the point of calling him overvalued.
Quan Peterson next up. You as a cornerback prospect from Rock Hill, South Carolina, 3-star prospect, and spent a little bit of time here at Syracuse before eventually transferring out. Quan Peterson played in 10 games. He actually played in both bowl games for Syracuse, both the Pinstripe Bowl and then the Boca Bowl before transferring out. Now, that brings us to some interesting names on the list here, Emily. I feel a lot of undervalued coming our way, but we'll see if you agree. Kevin Jobity Jr. comes in from Buffalo, 3-star defensive lineman prospect, and in his time at Syracuse so far has racked up 21 games, including 2 starts, 43 tackles, 11 tackles for loss, 4.5 sacks. I'm going to put an undervalued on that guy with somebody who's certainly got the opportunity to build on that.
Yeah, I think the key too with him is that he made a big jump from his freshman year to his sophomore year, not just in like the amount he was playing, but the amount he was able to do, right? Like that's the thing you look at is, okay, like in 5 games, he played 8. So we'll say in 8 games, his freshman season, he got 13 total tackles, 2 sacks. It's like, okay, the more you play, can you continue to raise your numbers on a trajectory that makes sense with that? And last season, he appeared in all 13 games, 30 tackles, so he more than doubled his tackle rate, and then sacks stayed consistent, rose to 2.5, and he also forced a fumble in there. So yeah, I think he's probably a case for undervalued. I know with some guys we've been like, okay, are we going to assign them a new star value? I'm like, obviously point stars don't exist, but I'd probably put him at like a 3.8, like just shy of a 4-star. Like I don't know that I would fully reassign him to be a 4-star yet, but I think as a I still think he's undervalued, if that makes sense.
So Emily, the next guy on our list is an interesting prospect, but we don't know if he's on the team, and it's Donovan Brown, who is a wide receiver, came in as a 3-star prospect and a guy who's played in 18 games for Syracuse, 27 catches, 321 yards. The valuable thing with Donovan too is he can return punts, he can give you some reps on special teams. But remember, at the end of spring ball, he was not on the roster. And to this moment that we're recording this, I don't know if that's been resolved yet. So I feel like if Brown is a part of this, he can get in there and mix it up with these receivers. And I would probably put an undervalued category on him, but we don't know if he's going to be in the mix as we record this here, but certainly somebody that I think would make that receiver room better if he was.
Right. The last we heard officially about Brown was after the spring game. This is what head coach Fran Brown, said at the time about wide receiver Donovan Brown. No relation. He's just not with the team right now. He's not with the team. He has some things he has to take care of between himself and the university and things of that nature. So he's not on the team right now. Good kid. He was trying to get himself right, but unfortunately, he's just not with the team at the moment. So yeah, we really aren't sure what's going on there. It's not to say we haven't been looking into it and stuff like that, but we don't have anything we can tell you right now.
So to be determined on that one.
Determined. But yeah, I mean, certainly if he is around, like he could be in the mix of this receiver room. We did see him have kind of some breakout games early in the season. He did drop off towards the end, but those first 5 games of the season, I mean, nothing like too crazy, but he had some big catches in that week 2 game. He had the 86-yard catch that was against Western Michigan, the 86-yard catch that I think was the one that went for touchdown. And so he was one of those guys that we were really intrigued in at the beginning of last season, and then didn't really hear from, and now potentially we won't hear from again. So yeah, met expectations, undervalued if he comes back and plays, but right now it's a little up in the air.
We'll keep an eye on that for sure. Joe Cruz next up here, offensive tackle, and he's a New York State prospect, which always perks things up a little bit here. And Joe so far, who's now at 6'5", 302, has played in 15 games. He's made 3 starts, played 12 games in 2023, including 3 starts, and has become a key depth guy on the offensive line. We mentioned through the spring how Dale Williams is evaluating things and looking at how this offensive line is going to go. I liked what I saw from Joe Cruz in spring ball. I think this is a guy that's going to push for playing time and at the very least has met expectations, but I think could get into that undervalued category if he gets out there and is a consistent starter for this team.
Yeah, I think Cruz is definitely an interesting case, and he's a name we've come around to a lot in the past year. Obviously, in the transfer portal, Syracuse did add offensive tackle Savion Washington from Colorado. He's expected to be a starter. We didn't see him in the spring. He came after that, but I'd say it's pretty strong that he's going to start. So that leaves one open tackle position, and there is a lot of other guys still on this offensive line that I think could jockey for it and potentially make a case there. But Joe Cruz, I think, is one of those guys that will seriously be jockeying for it. He's not like he's in the conversation in a way that I like. Even this time last year, I wouldn't have been like, oh yeah, Joe Cruz could be a starter. Like Joe Cruz could be a starter, but we'll see how that shakes out a little bit more. I do think, as it always is, like offensive line will be like the last thing that we feel fully confident about in terms of depth chart projections and stuff like that. But
I just remember every time walking away after focusing on the offensive line group in spring, he was just a name that always stuck with me. And I feel like he's just going to be one of those guys that's going to keep knocking on the door as we go down the road here. We've come to the lonely kickers, Emily. Max von Marburg. Oh, Max, what a prospect. Comes in from Australia. And look, there's been a lineage of punters at Syracuse in the last decade or so. Came in with that unique style. And at one point, Emily was on the Ray Guy watch list. I mean, he came in with a little bit of a reputation here, played 12 games at Syracuse, and eventually just left the program. Didn't transfer per se. Just, I don't know if he left football entirely or what Max is up to these days. But for a while there was a little buzz around Max, and he had a competition with James Williams, who came in as a highly touted punting prospect as well. And we certainly saw him on the field a bit, but maybe not as long as we thought we would.
Right. He was the starting punter for that 2022 season. Did okay. There were definitely some shaky moments, which is why then they went into the portal to get Jack Stonehouse from Missouri, MIZ. And then Max just didn't really see playing time. I do think though of that one game, it was the UNC game, I believe, where Jack Stonehouse got housed punting. Do you remember this?
I do.
I think it was
yes.
I think it was the UNC game. Yeah. And so then they hadn't brought Max on. This is less a case for Max specifically and more a case that you do need to have two people who can punt the ball. And we'll get into this with the next guy, right? Because the next guy we're going to talk about is Brady. But you need two guys on the roster who can punt the ball. And so Max was that guy last year. They brought in someone else, I think, through the transfer portal. I want to say a Cornell punter, an Ivy League punter, I believe, who will kind of fill that backup punter role. But for when Max was here, he did what he was supposed to, which is what this exercise is about, right? Like he met expectations, or
I agree.
I guess by the fact that he was unrated on 247, he exceeded expectations by seeing the playing field. But
some people
he did what he needed to do.
May lean overvalued, but he didn't come in highly touted. He was a special prospect. He was a project, if it is. And he started for a year, did what he had to do. As you mentioned, came in an emergency situation. So I'll put him met expectations on good old Max. And you mentioned it. That brings us to Brady Denberg, who was a team captain, kicker and kickoffs, as long so far as a place kicker is 46 yards, 10 of 16 on field goals. And what I'm looking at here, Emily, he was unrated coming in. So I'm tempted to say he's undervalued. He's serving the job. He is the kicker. He's got nowhere to go but up. He was respected enough to be voted a team captain. Like, there's somebody doing what he needs to do.
No, I definitely put him in undervalued. And this first season he was here, the 2022 season, he did most of the kickoffs too. They didn't have Schmidt doing the kickoffs. Schmidt was reserved solely for field goals. And so he was seeing the field as a true freshman. And it's not super rare to have two different kickers do those two different jobs. Often you see the same person do them, but to have split it up, especially with a guy like Andre Schmidt, who's still playing football, he's in the UFL now, and have given that role to a freshman, like, shows how talented I think Brady is. And I think we'll continue to see him be pretty strong for Syracuse this year. We are still waiting for the elusive 57 yarder that Dino said multiple times last year Brady can hit.
Haven't seen it yet.
In Ensley Athletic Center, I'll give it to you. We haven't seen it on the field yet. in a game. We'll see if maybe he can get there this year. If Fran Brown even puts him in that scenario.
Let's put it this way. I don't feel like Denberg runs on the field. We're talking automatic, like when Andre Schmidt ran on that field. And even Schmidt struggled when and boy, he's kicking butt now in the UFL for St. Louis. He booted one over 60 yards in a game this year.
Crazy.
But I never doubted Andre Schmidt on the field. Denberg, once we're getting past 43, 44 yards, like you said, I'm still waiting for it, but it's still a kicker that I feel can, come out there and do the job. Emily,
we punt. He can punt when you need him to, as we said.
And you need that, as we have seen, those fluke situations that can pop up in football. Here we go into the transfers, Emily, and this is becoming a much more prominent part of this conversation here. Syracuse brought in 8 transfers in this offseason. We're going to start with Carlos Del-Rio Wilson. Came in after a year at Florida. 4 stars, 3 stars, depending on which service you kind of look at here. And there was a little bit of a bump there because Syracuse needed to put some competition in the room at quarterback. Anytime a player was good enough to be recruited to and go to Florida, that's going to kind of raise your eyebrows a little bit. But we were still in the early stages of the transfer portal really taking hold here. And when you come in with that kind of reputation, there is a case to be made here that Carlos was overvalued. When he's had the opportunity to play, started a game last year, lost to Boston College, 7 of 17 in that game. Overall, 48 of 102, 624 yards, 4 touchdowns. But he's still firmly the backup quarterback. I'm frankly surprised he's still here, given maybe some opportunities he could have seen elsewhere. He will be the firm quarterback to start behind, of course, Kyle McCord this year. I think the appropriate tag, though, Emily, is met expectations. You brought in a quarterback to up the competition in the room. I don't think he was necessarily expected to become the starter. He's still the backup. And as we go forward here, I don't think anybody's expecting him to be the backup. So I'm going to put him expectations there, but I can see where overvalue would come from.
Yeah, I think he's probably one of those guys that could go in, that there's a very easy argument in either direction. The big thing I think about with Carlos all the time from conversations with Dino, with conversations with Carlos, with conversations with other people, like both coaches and watching the program, is like Carlos does have like a very raw, natural talent at the QB position. And this is always the thing, is we see this in practice. Like he can sling a ball like really far in practice. And like we do see him like execute things in practice, and you can see him stepping up. And I do think he's improved in like his leadership over the past 2 years, and we've seen him grow in that capacity. But even with the growth, both on field and off the field stuff, like even with that, like there still is just one building block that is always missing with him, that like it's like you can fit the key into the lock, but it won't turn. Like that's what I kind of feel like
too much. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It's just not easy enough with Carlos for them to be able to throw him in a game time situation and really see consistent success. Like he's good on the fly. He was good in that Notre Dame game, the 2022 season, when he had to step in for Schrader. Like so good. May I remind people that there were people coming out of that game being like, should he take over for Schrader? Like,
that's right,
because he closed that game so solidly. Then of course we get to the Pitt game and atrocious.
Reality set in.
I don't even want to think about that. And then he comes in for an extended time against Boston College this past year, gets hurt. Now he's going to be coming off an injury. So yeah, he's been such an interesting case these past 2 years. I think certainly an argument in either direction of overvalued or met expectations, especially again as a 3-star transfer. He was a 4-star in high school, but then got that reevaluation back down to 3.
But another important point that muddies the waters a bit, he did get hurt at the end of last year. So an interesting case in this exercise for sure. Demarcus Adams is next on our list. Wide receiver, came in from FAU, and he was really billed as a deep threat. And he did have 6 catches over 30 yards in his career at Syracuse. He had 9 catches for 271 yards. He also was key on special teams. He had 16 punt returns in his career with the Orange. The interesting thing is he had enough physical skills, Emily, that the Buffalo Bills brought him into rookie minicamp to take a look at him after he left. So the talent was always there. We just didn't see the consistent production given what he was brought in to do. I'm tempted to say overvalued because they just didn't get enough out of him out of the deep game, but how much of that was factors beyond his control and what he was asked to do in the offense. We mentioned some injuries to quarterbacks and maybe some things he couldn't control, but I would probably say overvalued given that, you know, the Bills were tempted enough to take a look at him and you look at his numbers and you're like, maybe they should have been a little higher here.
Yeah, again, with all these wide receivers we've been talking about, just with the past 2 years, it's so hard to judge knowing what was going on with the quarterback situation. And yes, there are mistakes and things that wide receivers do that are 100% their fault and are not the fault of the quarterback. But there is also so much that they can only do if the quarterback is healthy and throwing the ball, like getting the ball into the right place. And I think he did what he needed to do. So I'd probably go met expectations, but I was certainly impressed that he got that offer from the Bills and got to go through that with them. And we'll see if that continues or if he lands somewhere else as a free agent, or if he maybe lands in the UFL. But I'd say met expectations for Demarcus Adams.
Staying in the AFC East, Emily, Isaiah Johnson. Looking back at his time at Syracuse, 2-year starter, 188 tackles, had 2.5 sacks, 14 pass breakups, 3 interceptions, a captain, a starter, everything you would want out of a transfer. Come in, start, impact. He took a step up when coming to Syracuse as well, and is still, as we speak, on the roster for the Miami Dolphins with training camp set to start next month. I would probably put a big blinking undervalued tag on him, even though, again, with transfers, you know what the production is, kind of know what kind of player you're getting. But if you're telling me the day he signed that I was getting those kind of numbers and he's going to be in an NFL training camp, like, yeah, I'd feel pretty good about that.
Right. And people, considering some of there's 2 more names that people might get upset with me for saying this now. But like, besides LeQuint, I think Isaiah Johnson is the most undervalued in this group. Again, there are 2 other names.
Can be made. Yeah.
There are 2 other names that I think people will want to push back on that a little bit, and I understand that, and we'll talk about them when we get to them. But like, he went to Dartmouth as a unranked high school product, worked his way up to a 3-star transfer, lands at Syracuse the 2022 season, and contributes. Like, certainly doesn't do anything flashy. Like I said earlier when we were talking about Jeremiah Wilson and the cornerback situation last year, like, we knew Johnson would be one of the starters firmly, but no one was like, oh, great, we have Isaiah Johnson back, like, huge. It was just kind of like, Isaiah Johnson's going to be one of the starters. And I just think he like way overperformed expectations last season. That's not to say there weren't a few moments that I think there was like, ooh, like that could have been better and stuff like that. But his 2023 season was just so strong. And then to see him go on and be a free agent, he could have been drafted. There was potential that he was going to go in one of those late rounds. Like that was a possibility. He's certainly undervalued.
Elijah Clark is our next name, staying in the secondary here. A 4-star prospect, according to some, certainly 3-star prospect, comes in from Rutgers, 65 tackles, 3 pass breakups, 2 fumbles, 7 tackles for loss, 126 tackles in his career total so far. Now, don't get mad at me, guys, but here's what I'm going to say about Elijah. He met expectations, and here's why. He came in as somebody with a reputation. He came in as a productive player, stepped into Syracuse, and did, I think, what exactly was expected of him. Transfers are different than recruits. Transfers come in, you can watch film, you can look at the production, you can see what is being brought in for. The reasons for transferring are a myriad of reasons. Playing time, now that we're further down the road, NIL, things of that nature. I remember the minute Clark came here, I'm like, there's a guy that can contribute right away. I knew his reputation as a player. I think he came in and did exactly what was expected of him, because sometimes the expectations are a little higher for certain guys, and I would put him in that list. So that, to me, I'm complimenting Clark that he came in and met expectations and now has a chance to continue to build on that.
I think that's a really good point. And I honestly hadn't even been thinking about it that way. But you're right that he was one of those guys that you knew of, and when he was landed, like you knew he was going to be like, not all transfers who come in, you're like, that's an immediate starter. Like
Right.
this is maybe like a weighty comparison, but like Elijah Clark was kind of like the Kyle McCord or Fadil Diggs of this 2022 transfer portal class. Like
he was the guy.
He was the guy that you knew was going to come in and be the starter, or work his way into being a starter and a good position. One thing I will say for Clark is he has some of the highest PFF grades on the team, consistently grades out single games season as one of the highest, right up there with Justin Barron, who's also very highly graded. And so, like my gut was going to be to like say he was undervalued. And I think if we're like explicitly talking about the stars, like he was a 3-star transfer, and I would say that was undervaluing him, and he should be a 4-star transfer as he was in high school. But I think your point that this is what he was expected to be, this big of a contributor and a star, is a really good one.
CJ Hayes next on the list, going back to the wide receiver position, came in from Michigan State, ends up with 15 catches for 159 yards, and I would put squarely in the overvalued category. Yeah, some guys come in from certain schools, as we were just talking about with Clark, and you're expecting something right off the bat here. Syracuse needed the help at the position, but just never quite panned out to what I thought he would be. Which brings us to Dan Villari, who, remember, came to Syracuse as a quarterback. A quarterback from Michigan, nonetheless. There was a thought he could come in that quarterback room. They quickly discovered probably best to convert him to tight end. So he comes in the middle of his career, changes positions. And what we're looking at now is a guy who has 21 catches for 2,021 yards and 3 touchdowns, 64 rushes for 362 yards and 2 touchdowns. And to go back to his quarterback roots, when Syracuse was desperate because the quarterback position got decimated by injury last year, he's now 24 of 36 for 203 yards and a touchdown, passing the ball, Emily, and is now a leader, a team captain, and probably one of the more popular players on the team, not only within the team, but from the fan base. I think this is another one of those guys you were talking about earlier who could be one of the most undervalued transfers or players Syracuse has gotten really in the last 5 or 6 years.
God, Dan, such an interesting case. Again, this might be the most interesting class we've done, just because it has so many. These guys are still like firmly in the middle of their careers, and also there's just so many of them that have these really interesting stories about how they got here and what they've done. I'm curious how Dan gets used this year. And this is, I guess, taking the conversation in a little bit of a different direction. But I don't feel like we saw too much passing to the tight ends in spring ball. And
don't say it, Emily. Don't say it. Jeff Nixon on this show said we're throwing to the tight end. Don't do it.
I know that's been
don't
said.
crush my dream.
I know that's been said. And like, Fran knows what a talent and a weapon he has in Dan. So like, certainly he is going to be used. But it is going to look different than last year, right? Not just because of the obvious stuff. Like, they're not going to have to put Dan, knock on wood, in at quarterback at any point next season, unless they're running a trick play maybe. But like, I think his usage is going to look different, and so I'm a little bit intrigued by that.
But when you have him and OG on the roster, you got to throw him the ball.
Right. You do.
Yes.
But I'm looking forward to seeing him take a step forward in his blocking too.
Which he worked a lot on. As we saw on spring ball, there was a real emphasis on that, with Michael Johnson now over there working with the tight ends here. But Villari fits so many of the intangibles categories too. He was the guy that was willing to speak up in that last press conference before the bowl game about how things had to change. And he's got 14 ice packs all over him, and just what he's evolved into. Fan favorite, leader. We'll see how he's used this year, as you said, but all things considered, to get that much out of a guy who transferred here 2 years ago, let alone what he's going to bring you this year, huge contribution for Syracuse in a lot of ways. And the last two names. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, as a final closer, just because it should be said, like, he could have said no when they asked him to move positions, and he could have just transferred straight out of Syracuse again and been like, pardon my French, F that. Like, I'm going to go somewhere where they'll actually let me be a quarterback.
You wouldn't blame him. Yeah.
Instead, he was like, no, this is where I want to be, and I'm going to challenge myself, and I'm going to switch positions, and good on him.
Last two guys on the list, Emily. Jaan Price, who I felt like at a certain time was knocking right on the door as the backup running back, but they brought in Yassine Willis. He saw the writing on the wall. He was in and out of the transfer portal in his career and went back into it after this year. And Braylon Oliver, who was on the roster, played 60 snaps in 2022, and then was promptly removed from the roster and never heard from again in terms of Syracuse. So it's interesting how we started with a player who eventually left, and then we end with a player who, even as a transfer, eventually left the program as well. That's how the transfer portal turns, ladies and gentlemen. So as Emily said, I think that was one of the more interesting classes we've done so far. The mix of recruits, pure, if you will, LeQuint Allen notably, that came in and are still productive. But we're seeing a real tilt towards the transfer portal. 2023 is going to be a very interesting discussion when we talk about that class coming up. That is next in our series here, and the last in our series here. We'll have covered every year, 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023. We thank our Syracuse Sports Insiders, of course, for their great insight. Become one today if you haven't. You can text me directly anytime. Breaking news, opinions, everything sent to you first. 315-847-3895. For Emily Leiker, I'm Brent Axe. We'll talk to you next time here